She told me I was lucky she even dated me while I had an engagement ring hidden in my sock drawer. 3 years of what I thought was building something real with Isabella, gone in one evening when she decided I wasn't worth fighting for anymore. I'm a structural engineer, 28 years old, nothing flashy but stable with good income and my own downtown Chicago apartment overlooking the river. The kind of guy who shows up when he says he will, remembers anniversaries, and actually means what he promises. I'd been planning this 3-year anniversary dinner for 2 solid months, requesting the afternoon off from my job at Morrison Engineering to cook Isabella's favorite homemade lasagna from scratch using the recipe her Italian grandmother had taught me during our 2nd year together when I still believed we were building towards something permanent and meaningful. I'd spent the morning shopping for the perfect ingredients at that expensive gourmet market Isabella loved, buying imported San Marzano tomatoes, fresh basil, and the specific brand of ricotta her nana had sworn by, wanting every detail to remind her of family dinners and the stories she'd share about learning to cook from the woman who'd raised her after her parents' divorce. The antique locket had cost me 4 months of brown bag lunches and skipped happy hours, a delicate silver piece from the 1920s with intricate Art Deco engravings that reminded me of the vintage jewelry she'd stopped to admire in shop windows during our weekend walks through Lincoln Park, always commenting on the craftsmanship but never expecting me to notice how her eyes lingered on the pieces that spoke to her love of history and elegant details. I'd arranged everything perfectly in our apartment, dimming the lights and setting up pillar candles on the dining table we'd picked out together at that furniture store where she'd spent 3 hours debating between oak and walnut, settling on the oak because I'd mentioned how it reminded me of my grandfather's workshop. Fresh white roses filled the crystal vase her sister had given us last Christmas when everyone in both our families still assumed we'd be the next to get engaged, back when Isabella would show me wedding dresses on Pinterest and talk about whether we'd want a spring or fall ceremony. I'd chilled the bottle of Chianti Classico she'd discovered during our trip to Tuscany the previous summer, the one she'd insisted was too expensive to drink casually but perfect for special occasions, though I was starting to realize that our definitions of what constituted special were becoming increasingly different. Isabella finally arrived home at 7:15, 47 minutes late from her job at Meridian Boutique, one of those upscale fashion stores where a simple blouse cost more than most people's car payments and the clientele expected to be treated like royalty regardless of how they spoke to the staff. She immediately launched into her usual complaints about difficult customers and her demanding manager Sharon, a woman in her 50s who'd built the business from nothing but apparently didn't understand how exhausting it was for Isabella to deal with people who wanted to try on clothes they couldn't actually afford, as if being beautiful and well-dressed somehow qualified her to judge other people's financial situations. Isabella dropped her oversized designer purse on the granite kitchen counter with the dramatic sigh she'd perfected over our 3 years together, completely ignoring the romantic ambience, the careful timing, the smell of homemade food, or the significance of the date itself. She kicked off her heels and made a beeline for the couch without so much as acknowledging that this was supposed to be our special evening celebrating 3 years of what I'd foolishly believed was mutual love, respect, and commitment to building something lasting together. While I plated the lasagna and tried to salvage what remained of the romantic mood I'd worked all day to create, Isabella collapsed onto our leather sectional and immediately pulled out her phone, her perfectly manicured thumbs moving rapidly across the screen as she responded to messages from friends, coworkers, and apparently several other people who ranked higher on her priority list than the man who'd taken vacation time to cook her dinner from scratch. I watched her scroll through Instagram stories, occasionally laughing out loud at posts from her girlfriends whose relationships seemed to require constant public validation through expensive dinners, designer gifts, and elaborate romantic gestures that generated the kind of social media engagement that had become more important to Isabella than actual connection. She'd comment on photos of engagement rings and exotic vacation destinations, double-tapping pictures of couples at 5-star restaurants while ignoring the man who'd spent his afternoon carefully layering pasta and sauce in the hopes of creating one meaningful moment between us. I finally convinced Isabella to join me at the dinner table after waiting 20 minutes for her to finish responding to what seemed like an endless stream of text messages, though she brought her phone with her like some kind of lifeline, setting it face up next to her wine glass where she could monitor every notification that buzzed through during our supposedly romantic anniversary meal. The lasagna was still warm but no longer the perfect temperature I'd timed so carefully. And I'd barely finished explaining how I'd spent the morning driving to 3 different specialty stores to track down the exact San Marzano tomatoes her grandmother had insisted were essential for authentic flavor when Isabella's phone lit up with yet another message from someone named Damien with a red heart emoji prominently displayed next to his name, a detail that made my stomach drop even as I tried to maintain the pleasant conversation about our shared memories and future plans that I'd been rehearsing all week. When I gently asked who was texting her so persistently during what was supposed to be our special evening together, Isabella didn't even have the courtesy to look embarrassed about being caught prioritizing someone else's attention over mine, instead launching into this oddly enthusiastic explanation about how she'd recently reconnected with Damian Rodriguez, her college boyfriend from Northwestern who'd apparently reached out through Instagram a few weeks ago claiming he just wanted to catch up and see how life had treated her since graduation, though the frequency and timing of their communications suggested their renewed connection involved significantly more than casual reminiscing about their shared past. She described their digital reunion with the kind of genuine excitement and animated energy she hadn't displayed when talking about anything involving me or our relationship in what felt like months, explaining in vivid detail how Damien really understood her creative ambitions and her frustrations with working in retail when she knew she had so much more potential waiting to be unleashed on the world, how he'd successfully started his own boutique marketing agency specializing in luxury lifestyle brands and was apparently doing incredibly well for himself financially, making the kind of money that afforded him a penthouse apartment in Beverly Hills, European vacations, and the sort of sophisticated urban lifestyle Isabella had always dreamed about but never quite managed to achieve here in Chicago with someone like me. I watched her face transform as she scrolled through what appeared to be an extensive ongoing conversation filled with inside jokes, shared references to professors and campus hangouts, and intimate details about their respective lives that didn't include me and apparently carried more emotional weight than the 3 years we'd spent carefully building what I'd foolishly believed was our own collection of meaningful experiences, private jokes, and mutual understanding. When I suggested as diplomatically as possible that perhaps texting with an ex-boyfriend during our anniversary dinner wasn't the most appropriate timing for catching up on old friendships, Isabella's expression shifted instantly from animated and glowing to defensive and sharp, her voice taking on that cold, dismissive edge she'd been developing whenever I questioned anything about her behavior, her choices, or her apparent need to maintain connections that seemed designed to make me feel inadequate and replaceable. She told me I was being possessive and controlling, that Damien was simply a friend from her past and I needed to trust her judgment about who she chose to maintain relationships with, as if the heart emoji and the secretive late-night texting sessions were perfectly innocent expressions of platonic friendship rather than obvious signs that something inappropriate was developing between them. The conversation escalated rapidly when Isabella casually mentioned that she and Damien had already made plans to meet for coffee the following Saturday afternoon, ostensibly just to catch up in person and discuss some potential business opportunities he'd mentioned since his agency was constantly seeking talented people who understood fashion, lifestyle marketing, and the kind of sophisticated aesthetic that could help his clients reach their target demographics more effectively. She became visibly agitated when I expressed legitimate concern about her secret meetings with an ex-boyfriend, accusing me of trying to control her social life and deliberately holding her back from networking opportunities that could potentially transform her entire career trajectory, elevating her from a retail worker who dealt with difficult customers to a creative professional who worked with high-end brands and actually got paid what she was worth rather than settling for whatever salary some small boutique owner decided she deserved. That's when Isabella really revealed her true feelings about our relationship, telling me in the cruelest, most calculated voice I'd ever heard from her that I should honestly consider myself incredibly lucky that someone like her had even bothered dating someone like me for as long as she had, that she was obviously and objectively out of my league in every way that mattered and could absolutely do so much better whenever she decided to stop settling for mediocrity and actually pursue the kind of relationship she deserved with someone who matched her ambition, her standards, and her vision for what life could look like when you weren't afraid to take risks and demand excellence from yourself and your partner. Isabella set down her wine glass with deliberate precision and launched into what felt like a carefully rehearsed presentation comparing me unfavorably to Damien in every conceivable category, as if she'd been mentally cataloging my deficiencies for months and had finally found the perfect opportunity to present her comprehensive case for why I was fundamentally inadequate as long-term partner material for someone with her particular standards and expectations. She explained with devastating clarity how Damien represented everything she'd always truly wanted in a relationship but had foolishly convinced herself to compromise on when she'd made the mistake of choosing to build a life with someone safe, predictable, and ultimately boring like me. Someone who prioritized financial stability and comfortable routine over the kind of bold entrepreneurial risks that separated genuinely successful people from those who settled for mediocre middle-class existences and called it achievement. According to Isabella's detailed and apparently long-considered analysis, Damien possessed the kind of natural charisma, creative vision, and ambitious drive that opened doors and created extraordinary opportunities wherever he went, while I was pathetically content to show up at the same structural engineering firm every day, work on the same types of uninspiring commercial projects, collect the same predictable bi-weekly paycheck, and never once push myself to achieve something truly remarkable, impressive, or worthy of respect from people who actually mattered in the world. She described with obvious excitement how Damien's boutique marketing agency wasn't just another small business struggling to pay rent and meet payroll, but rather a rapidly expanding creative empire that attracted high-profile luxury clients from across the entertainment and fashion industries, generating the kind of substantial revenue that funded spontaneous first-class trips to Paris and Tokyo, exclusive private dinner parties with influential celebrities and business moguls, and the sort of sophisticated cosmopolitan lifestyle that made other people genuinely envious rather than merely comfortable with their modest suburban aspirations. Isabella's voice grew increasingly animated and passionate as she painted vivid, detailed pictures of the glamorous life she could potentially have with someone like Damien, someone who truly understood that real success meant taking calculated risks and building something extraordinary from nothing rather than settling for the kind of predictable, soul-crushing domestic future I apparently represented, complete with 30-year mortgage payments, weekend trips to Home Depot for lawn care supplies, and the sort of mind-numbing routine that slowly suffocated creative spirits like hers until they forgot what it felt like to dream big and expect more from life than simple contentment and financial security. She told me with brutal honesty that our entire 3-year relationship had essentially been her settling for significantly less than she knew she deserved while secretly waiting for someone better to come along and rescue her from the mistake of choosing security over passion, someone who could actually match her intelligence, properly appreciate her untapped potential, and provide the kind of exciting intellectual partnership that challenged her to grow and evolve rather than just accepting her exactly as she was without any expectation of personal or professional development. Isabella revealed that she'd been seriously questioning everything about our future together for the past several months, wondering almost daily whether she was foolishly wasting her prime years with someone who would never be able to give her the sophisticated, culturally rich life she'd always envisioned for herself, the kind of life where she attended fashion weeks in Milan and New York, hosted elegant dinner parties for interesting people, and moved confidently in social circles where conversations revolved around art exhibitions, literature, international business strategies, and innovative creative projects rather than mortgage interest rates, home improvement television shows, and retirement portfolio diversification strategies. I quietly stood up from the dinner table where the anniversary meal I'd spent hours preparing had grown cold while listening to Isabella systematically dismantle everything I'd believed about our relationship, my face completely expressionless as she continued talking about her confusion and her desperate need for space to explore what she really wanted from life, as if 3 years of shared experiences, mutual support, and careful planning for our future together had suddenly become obstacles, preventing her from discovering her true destiny with someone more worthy of her attention and affection. Without saying a single word in response to her lengthy explanation of my inadequacies, I walked directly to our bedroom and began methodically packing a single black duffel bag with the essentials I'd need for an extended stay away from the apartment where I'd foolishly believed we were building something permanent together, carefully folding the work shirts I'd need for meetings, grabbing my laptop charger, toiletries, and enough clothes to last several weeks while I figured out my next. So, Isabella followed me down the hallway, her voice becoming increasingly agitated as she alternated between justifying her harsh assessment of our relationship and demanding to know where I thought I was going at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, as if my sudden departure was somehow more unreasonable than her casual announcement that she'd been mentally shopping for my replacement while pretending to be committed to our shared future. I moved through our bedroom with methodical precision, gathering my passport from the desk drawer, my backup phone charger from the nightstand, and the small wooden box where I kept my grandfather's cufflinks and other meaningful personal items that belonged to me alone rather than to the couple we'd apparently never actually been despite 3 years of shared holidays, joint checking accounts, and conversations about marriage timelines and potential baby names. The antique locket I'd planned to give her during dessert remained unopened on the dresser where I'd placed it that morning while imagining her face lighting up with joy and surprise, though now it just looked like evidence of how completely I'd misunderstood what this woman actually wanted from me and our relationship, a romantic gesture rendered meaningless by her revelation that she'd been quietly comparing me to her ex-boyfriend and finding me pathetically inadequate in every category that mattered to her vision of success and happiness. Isabella became increasingly frantic as my silence stretched on, demanding that I stop being dramatic and talk to her like a rational adult who could discuss relationship problems without resorting to childish gestures like packing bags and storming out in the middle of important conversations about their future together, though I noticed she seemed more concerned about my reaction than about the actual impact of her words on someone who genuinely believed they were loved and valued by their partner. She kept insisting that I was misunderstanding her intentions, that she wasn't trying to hurt me but simply being honest about her feelings and her need to explore other possibilities before making any permanent commitments, as if her brutal assessment of my character and prospects had been some kind of thoughtful gift rather than a calculated destruction of everything I'd invested in our relationship over the past 3 years. I zipped the duffel bag closed and slung it over my shoulder, pausing only to grab my car keys from the bowl by the front door where we developed the habit of leaving them during the early months of our relationship when small domestic routines had seemed like evidence of our growing intimacy and shared commitment to building a life together. Isabella's voice reached a higher pitch as she realized I was actually leaving, not just making some temporary dramatic gesture to get her attention or force her to reconsider her position, but genuinely walking away from 3 years of shared history without offering any explanation, apology, or promise to work through our problems together like mature adults who understood that all relationships required compromise and patience. She followed me to the door, alternating between angry demands that I explain my behavior and desperate pleas that I stay so we could continue discussing what she'd meant and how we could move forward in a way that honored both of our needs and concerns. Though her definition of honoring my needs apparently involved accepting my role as a placeholder boyfriend while she explored more exciting options with men who offered better prospects for the glamorous lifestyle she'd decided she deserved. I walked out of our apartment without saying goodbye, without looking back, without offering any explanation for my sudden departure or any indication of when or if I planned to return, leaving Isabella standing in the doorway watching the man she'd just finished rejecting disappear into the Chicago night with everything that mattered to him fitting into a single duffel bag. I drove directly to an extended-stay hotel on the north side of town, the kind of generic corporate accommodation designed for business travelers and people in transition, and paid for a month in advance using the credit card I'd been planning to use for our upcoming vacation to Napa Valley, a trip we'd discussed endlessly and that now seemed like another naive fantasy about a future that had never actually existed outside my own hopeful imagination. Over the next 4 years, I threw myself into rebuilding my life with the kind of focused determination I'd previously reserved for complex engineering projects, channeling the energy I'd wasted trying to make Isabella happy into advancing my career and developing the expertise that would eventually transform me from a competent employee into a recognized leader in my field. I spent 18 months studying for my professional engineer license, working late nights and weekends to master the additional technical knowledge and regulatory requirements while simultaneously taking on increasingly challenging projects at Morrison Engineering that showcased my ability to design innovative solutions for complex structural problems. The promotion to senior engineer came with a substantial salary increase that I invested wisely rather than spending on the kind of lifestyle upgrades Isabella had always pressured me to pursue, building a solid financial foundation that would support the entrepreneurial risks I'd never been brave enough to consider while worrying about maintaining the comfortable stability she'd ultimately found so inadequate and boring. When the opportunity arose to start my own structural consulting firm specializing in sustainable building design, I had the savings, credentials, and professional network necessary to make the transition successfully, something I never would have accomplished while subsidizing someone else's dreams and managing the constant emotional drama that had characterized my relationship with Isabella. I relocated to Austin, Texas, where the booming construction industry and environmentally conscious building codes created the perfect market for my expertise in green engineering solutions, and where the lower cost of living allowed me to establish my business without the crushing overhead expenses that made Chicago such a challenging place for new entrepreneurs to succeed. My firm, Sterling Structural Solutions, grew steadily as word spread about my innovative approaches to energy-efficient commercial buildings and earthquake-resistant residential designs, attracting clients who valued technical excellence and environmental responsibility over flashy presentations and superficial charm. The professional satisfaction of building something meaningful from nothing proved far more rewarding than any romantic relationship I'd ever experienced, though I remained open to meeting someone who could appreciate both my success and the steady character traits that Isabella had found so disappointingly predictable. I met Rachel Chen at a sustainability conference in Denver where I was presenting a paper on carbon-neutral building materials, and she was discussing her research into urban pollution mitigation strategies. And from our first conversation about shared environmental values and professional goals, I knew I'd found someone whose intelligence and ambition complemented rather than competed with my own. Rachel was a brilliant environmental scientist with a PhD from Stanford who worked for the EPA developing policies to reduce industrial emissions, someone whose career success came from genuine expertise and dedicated work rather than social connections or manipulative charm, and who appreciated my methodical approach to problem-solving as evidence of reliability rather than a character flaw to be overcome. Our relationship developed naturally over months of long phone calls about everything from renewable energy technologies to favorite hiking trails, building the kind of intellectual and emotional foundation that I'd mistakenly thought I'd had with Isabella but now recognized as completely different in its depth, authenticity, and mutual respect. Rachel never made me feel inadequate for preferring quiet evenings at home to expensive restaurants, never compared me unfavorably to other men, never suggested that my stable income and practical approach to life were somehow insufficient for someone with her standards and expectations. Instead, she seemed genuinely grateful to have found a partner who shared her values, supported her career ambitions, and brought the same level of commitment to our relationship that she did, creating the kind of equal partnership that Isabella had claimed to want but had ultimately rejected in favor of pursuing more exciting but less substantial connections. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a restored barn outside Austin, surrounded by close friends and family who'd watched us build something genuine together, and honeymoon hiking through Glacier National Park discussing our shared dreams of designing and building an off-grid home that would serve as a model for sustainable living. Meanwhile, according to mutual friends who occasionally provided unwanted updates, Isabella's Los Angeles adventure with Damien had crashed spectacularly within 8 months when his supposedly successful marketing agency turned out to be little more than an elaborate social media facade designed to attract investors and impress women, leaving her stranded in an expensive city with no job, no savings, and no local support system when he abandoned her for a younger influencer whose Instagram following better served his business goals. She'd bounced between a series of increasingly desperate relationships with men who promised her the lifestyle she craved but ultimately proved either unable or unwilling to provide the financial security and social status she demanded in exchange for her companionship, each failed romance leaving her more bitter and cynical about finding someone who could give her everything she believed she deserved. The last I'd heard, Isabella had moved back to Chicago where she was working as a server at an upscale restaurant in River North. Sharing a cramped apartment with two roommates and spending her tips on maintaining the designer wardrobe and beauty treatments she considered essential to attracting the kind of wealthy boyfriend who could rescue her from the consequences of her own poor judgment and unrealistic expectations about what life owed someone simply for being attractive and ambitious. Isabella must have discovered my success through the kind of dedicated social media stalking that people do when they're trying to measure their own progress against former lovers who've moved on without them, learning about sterling structural solutions through LinkedIn posts and industry articles that featured my work on several high-profile sustainable building projects across Texas and the Southwest. She would have seen photos from Rachel's and my wedding posted by mutual friends, pictures of us hiking in national parks, professional headshots from conferences where I'd been invited as a keynote speaker, and all the other evidence of a life built on genuine achievement rather than the superficial markers of success she'd always prioritized over substance and character. When the American Society of Civil Engineers invited me to deliver the opening presentation at their annual Chicago conference on innovative green building technologies, Isabella apparently saw it as the perfect opportunity to reinsert herself into my life, timing her appearance with the kind of calculated precision she'd always applied to manipulating situations in her favor. I just finished my 45-minute keynote presentation about incorporating renewable energy systems into commercial building design when I spotted her in the lobby of the Palmer House Hotel, standing near the registration desk in a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, looking nervously rehearsed as she pretended to read conference materials while obviously waiting for me to notice her presence. She approached me as I was accepting congratulations from several attendees who'd been impressed by my presentation, interrupting a conversation with a potential client to claim she'd happened to be in the area and thought she'd stop by to see how I was doing, as if randomly attending a specialized engineering conference was the kind of coincidence that occurred naturally rather than the result of careful planning and deliberate manipulation. Isabella made a point of mentioning how proud she was of my professional success, speaking in the kind of wistful tone that suggested she'd always known I had this potential and had somehow been instrumental in helping me discover it, conveniently forgetting that she'd spent 3 years making me feel inadequate and unambitious compared to men like Damien who talked a better game but delivered far less substantial results. She commented on how impressive my keynote had been, claiming she'd watched from the back of the auditorium and been amazed by my confidence and expertise, though I suspected she'd learned about my presentation topics from the conference website rather than actually sitting through technical discussions about sustainable construction materials and energy-efficient HVAC systems. When other conference attendees approached to continue our earlier conversations about potential consulting projects, Isabella lingered nearby with the kind of strategic patience that indicated she had no intention of leaving until she'd accomplished whatever goal had brought her to this carefully orchestrated reunion. She waded through several networking conversations before suggesting we catch up over coffee at the hotel restaurant, positioning the invitation as a casual opportunity to reminisce about old times rather than the calculated attempt at reconnection that I immediately recognized it to be. Isabella made subtle comments about how successful and confident I'd become, how marriage and business ownership clearly agreed with me, and how she'd always suspected I'd eventually achieve the kind of recognition and respect that my dedication and intelligence deserved, rewriting our shared history to cast herself as someone who'd believed in my potential rather than someone who'd systematically undermined my confidence for 3 years. She hinted at her own struggles and mistakes without providing specific details, testing the waters to see if I might be susceptible to feeling sorry for her or curious about the challenges she'd faced since choosing excitement and adventure over the stable partnership I'd offered her when we were together. Throughout our brief conversation, Isabella maintained the kind of carefully controlled demeanor that suggested she'd practiced this encounter extensively, managing her expressions and word choices to project just the right combination of regret, admiration, and subtle availability that might appeal to a man who'd once loved her enough to plan a marriage proposal. When Isabella asked if we could talk privately away from the conference crowds, I recognized the request as the opening move in what was clearly going to be a carefully rehearsed attempt at reconciliation, though I was curious enough about her strategy to agree to move our conversation to a quieter corner of the hotel lounge where she could deliver whatever speech she'd prepared for this moment. She began with what appeared to be a well-practiced monologue about personal growth, acknowledging that she'd made terrible mistakes in her 20s and had spent the past several years learning hard lessons about what truly mattered in relationships, claiming that her experiences with men like Damien had taught her to value stability, loyalty, and genuine partnership over the superficial excitement and glamorous lifestyle she'd once prioritized above everything else. Isabella told me with apparent sincerity that I was the one who got away, the man she should never have let go, the partner who'd offered her everything she'd been too immature and foolish to appreciate when she'd had the chance to build something lasting with someone who actually deserved her love and commitment rather than men who'd used her naivety and romantic fantasies to serve their own selfish purposes. She explained that she'd realized over time that the qualities she'd once found boring and predictable about me, my reliability, my thoughtfulness, my commitment to planning for the future, were actually the exact characteristics that separated men worth loving from the charming narcissists and ambitious manipulators who dominated her dating life since our relationship ended so badly that night 4 years ago. I listened to her carefully constructed apology and self-reflection with the same analytical attention I'd bring to evaluating a structural engineering proposal, noting the strategic elements of her presentation while remaining completely unmoved by her apparent transformation into someone who supposedly understood the value of what we'd once shared together. When Isabella finished her prepared remarks and looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping for some sign that her words had reopened the possibility of rekindling our connection, I calmly told her that I was genuinely grateful for how things had worked out between us, because her rejection had forced me to build a better life and find someone who truly valued the qualities she'd spent 3 years making me feel ashamed of possessing. I explained that Rachel and I were expecting our first child in the spring, that my business was thriving beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I was younger and less confident, and that I'd never been happier or more fulfilled both personally and professionally than I was in the life I'd created after she'd made it clear that I wasn't good enough for her standards and expectations. When Isabella asked with obvious desperation whether there might be any possibility for us to reconnect as friends, suggesting that we'd shared too much history to let it disappear completely, I politely but firmly told her that chapter of my life was permanently closed, that she'd lost me forever the moment she'd chosen to disrespect our relationship and dismiss me as inadequate while pursuing someone who represented everything I'd never be able to offer her. I stood up from our table, shook her hand with the same professional courtesy I'd extend to any business acquaintance, and walked away from Isabella Martinez for the final time, feeling nothing but relief that the woman who'd once made me question my worth had finally received a clear demonstration of the life she'd forfeited when she decided that a stable, loving partnership wasn't exciting enough to satisfy her ambitions and romantic fantasies.